Okay, class, this is the lecture on VUS 2 Colonial America, and we're looking specifically at early colonization and the exploration and settlement of North America. And I'm just going to kind of go over a few things with you that I think need a little explanation, or need a little more explanation that you didn't get from the study guides. So let me go through these points with you. Again, we're looking at the early period, the early colonial period in American history. So we're talking early, like 1607, 1609, on through the 1600s. Virginia and the other southern colonies, we know, were settled by people seeking economic opportunities. Some of the early Virginia settlers were Cavaliers, and you know from studying the vocab that Cavaliers were English nobility who received large land grants in eastern Virginia from the King of England for their loyalty to him in the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651. So these Cavalier families are coming over the middle to latter part of the 17th century. Some of Virginia's oldest families are descended from these Cavaliers. For example, the Berkeleys, the Norwoods, the Washingtons, the Madisons, the Monroes, the Marshalls, and the Lees. These families collectively are known as Virginia's first families, and they were the prime players in what we call the Virginia aristocracy. That would be the colonial elite, the people with the most money, the most land, and the most political power. Poor English immigrants also came to Virginia. They were seeking better lives as small farmers and artisans. And you know that artisans are people who are highly skilled at making things. For example, a tinsmith would be someone who makes things out of tin, and they had one at Jamestown. A potter, someone who makes pots and plates and drinking vessels out of clay. Maybe a silversmith later on, someone who creates nice things out of silver. Again, artisans are people who are highly skilled at making things with their hands, and they're highly sought after. Poor English immigrants tended to come over earlier than the Cavaliers, but a lot of those earliest settlers that came to the Virginia colony, the 1610, 1612 area, a lot of those were very poor English people coming to America looking for an opportunity for a better life. These poor English immigrants often settled in the Shenandoah Valley or in parts of western Virginia. So if you go out 64 now and get out past Richmond, where the highway starts to roll a little bit, it's not flat like it is here, that's where they're going. They're going out there and beyond to find land to farm and places to live. An indentured servant now is a little bit different. A poor immigrant, a poor English immigrant, could be an indentured servant, or maybe not. It just depends on the circumstances. An indentured servant is someone who agreed to work on a plantation, in this case, in the southern colonies. In the middle colonies or in New England, they had indentured servants. They just didn't work on plantations. They did other things. But here in the South, primarily, indentured servants would be working on plantations as field hands, out in the fields actually cutting the tobacco, tending to the tobacco, and harvesting the tobacco. And they would typically work for a period of time, I think something like 5 to 7 years maybe, in order to pay for their trip to the New World, or their passage, we would say, to the New World. So indentured servants didn't typically get money. What they got instead was a place to sleep and some clothes and some food, and they had to work very hard for that. Their labor was owned by the person who owned their indenturement. An indenture was like a contract, so an indenturement would be actually the physical paper contract. And the servant would be, again, bound to work for a term of or a period of time on that contract or indenturement. Again, like that time would be predetermined, maybe 5, 6, 7 years. Once that time was up, the one who owned the contract or who owned the indenturement, and again, usually a wealthy planter, would give his servant tools and 50 acres of land to start his own farm. And usually, as time passed, that land was further and further west as the eastern plots of land started to fill up with people. So, excuse me, indentured servants again worked for a predetermined period of time for a planter who owned their contract or owned their indenturement. How did planters come into possession of those indenturements? Well, if you were a poor English young man, say 16, 17 years old, and you wanted to come to the New World, you wanted to come to Virginia, what you might do is enter an indenturement with a ship's captain. So you would agree to sell your labor to that ship's captain, or exchange your labor to that ship's captain for a ride to the New World. So the ship's captain would draw up the contract or the indenturement, and he would sign it, you would sign it, and then you would be bound to him for that predetermined amount of time, 5 to 7 years. Once he arrived with his ship in the New World, say at Jamestown, an auction would be held, and planters would bid on that contract or that indenturement, and the highest bidder would win the indenturement, and with that, you and your labor. So that's how you came to be in possession of or I should say, the possession, in a sense, of a planter. You were not a slave. You still had rights in court. You could own property, but you did have a debt to pay, and that debt was being paid with your labor. Okay, so it's not quite the same thing as slavery. With African slavery, as we'll see later, these people had no rights and they couldn't own property. But an indentured servant did have rights and could own property and use the court system and things like that. The indentured servitude labor system, is what we'll call it, was in place in the South until it was finally replaced by African slavery around the end of the 1600s. So if you came to Virginia between, say, 1607 and, 1670, 1680, 1690, somewhere in there, and went out into a tobacco field, what you would see would be a lot of indentured servants from Europe. These were men and women, mainly men, who came from Europe, and again, they were serving their term of service under their indenturement. Gradually, starting about 1650 or so, you would start to see more and more African slaves, and then later African American slaves, replacing them in the fields, doing the field work. So that by about, again, 1670, 80, or 90, if you looked at that same tobacco field that you looked at earlier and saw mostly indentured servants, by that time you're going to see mostly Africans or African Americans, as the indentured servitude system is gradually phased out and replaced by African slavery. Okay, the next thing I want to look at is kind of an overview of the colonial economic system, and I want you to understand that it's this economic system that's fueling what's happening in Virginia, what's happening in the colonies, and who's coming here and why they're coming here. Okay, so we're going to call this lecture mercantilism. It's spelled mercantilism. Okay, colonial economies developed under the European system of mercantilism, which was, kind of determined, I should say, what the colony focused on economically would be determined by climate, soil conditions, and availability of natural resources. So let me kind of separate some things for you. I mentioned mercantilism, kind of set that off to the side for a minute, and let me talk about these other things that help determine what a colony is going to focus on economically. If you're in Virginia, for example, where you have a long growing season because we have warm weather here because of our latitude. We have, here on the coastal plain, in the coastal lowlands, we have flat soil, and it's very fertile. Okay, so the soil conditions are good. We have deep, navigable water. In other words, the rivers we have are deep enough for big ships to navigate, so we call that navigable water. All those things lend themselves well to the creation of an agricultural economy. If you've got a long growing season, if the ships can get out and in and out easily, why not grow crops? That seems like just kind of like a no-brainer. Okay, but it wasn't like that in the other colonial regions. For example, if you go up to New England, they didn't have the long growing season. They didn't have the vast coastal plain that we have here in the tidewater. Their land tended to be rockier, and there's great trees, lots of tall, straight trees up there, and they do have deep water for navigation, but it's very cold, so it actually is filled with great fish. Okay, and good fishing. So in the colonial New England economy, they're going to focus on shipbuilding because they have the deep navigable waters. They have the tall trees for cutting. They're going to focus on fishing. And I don't mean like get a hook and a bobber and go fishing. I mean like boats going out into the ocean and casting nets and bringing back fish to sell at a market, okay? And some other things that you can go back and look at in the notes. I'm not going to dwell on those too much. But again, what I want you to understand is that the economy of the region, the colonial region, is going to be determined by climate and geography, and consequently, who comes to the colony is also going to be determined by climate and by geography and natural resources and all those things we just talked about. For example, let's say you live back in England and you are a skilled shipwright. A shipwright is someone who knows how to build a ship. They can take the tree, skin the tree down, make the timber out of it, and shape that trunk into a ship and build the ship's parts. And that is a highly skilled, very sought after person who can do that. You're probably going to go to New England where they have trees for making ships in deep water and other shipbuilders. Would you go to Virginia? Well, yeah, you may, but chances are you wouldn't, because there just isn't that much of a need for shipbuilding here, and that industry hasn't grown up here. Well, that's not true. We have the shipyard, so maybe this wasn't the best example, but it doesn't grow up here like it does in New England. What I mean by that, there's more shipbuilding in colonial New England than there is in Virginia. I don't think Newport News shipbuilding got started until the late 17th century, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, another example might be, for example, if back in England you knew how to farm. Say you knew how to grow crops. Are you going to go to Virginia, where there's a lot of good farmland? Or are you going to go to New England, where there isn't as much good farmland? Well, chances are there's a good chance you're going to Virginia. So again, let me drive that point home. The climate, soil condition, availability of natural resources will determine a region's economy. And the region's economy is going to determine what kinds of people come to the colony, what kinds of skills they're going to have. I hope that makes sense. If not, ask me in class. Now, the economic system during the colonial period was called mercantilism. It was the system used by big imperial nations like England. For example, an imperial nation is a nation that has colonies. And under mercantilism, the reason a nation would take a colony, like England would have the American colonies, mainly is because of availability of natural resources and maybe some strategic advantage, some strategic location. Those really are the reasons that imperial nations have colonies. But anyway, back to mercantilism. Mercantilism created a system of interdependence between the mother country and its colonies. Let me say that again. Mercantilism created a system of interdependence between the mother country and its colonies, meaning that the mother country depended on the colonies for something, and the colonies depended on the mother country for something. And we'll get more into that in a second. So mercantilism, it's a little bit complicated. It's a little bit of a complicated economic theory, but we're just kind of looking at the basics here. Mercantilists are people who practiced mercantilism. Mercantilists believed that a nation's wealth was tied to its exports, the things that the nation could export and sell to other countries. So, for example, England exported English-made manufactured goods to other countries, and also to its own colonies, like Virginia. Manufactured goods could be anything from fine furniture, tables, chairs, to very nice clothing, wigs. Believe it or not, that was a big export. Clay pipes, because colonists smoked tobacco and so did Europeans. Let's see, England exported tools, some of the finest tools in the world, and also ship's parts, so the things that went onto a ship to help a ship work that needed to be finished back in England. So England used its colonies to supply those things. So colonies played, let me say it again, England used its colonies to supply the raw materials it needed to make the things it exported. So colonies played a really important role in mercantilism. A colony like Virginia would supply raw materials to England to be turned into finished or manufactured goods for export to other countries. I'm going to use the example of tobacco, even though tobacco really isn't a raw material. It really is an agricultural product. It still fits here, so I'm going to go with tobacco. Tobacco, we know, was grown here. In fact, if we could roll the clock back to 1609, and if you're listening to this podcast or this recording, the screencast in class, you're setting literally on land that was planted with tobacco back in the 17th century. It is right under your feet. So Virginia would export that tobacco to England, where it was processed, packaged, and then shipped out and sold to other European countries for a profit to England. This relationship benefited the planter here in Virginia because it helped him, make a living growing tobacco, but it also fueled, in part, the English economy. So the relationship I want you to understand here is this. Write this down. Colonies provide raw material to the mother country. The mother country takes that raw material and makes a finished product and sells it either to other countries or back to the colony itself, or both. Now I want to have a quick discussion about tobacco cultivation in the South. Tobacco cultivation requires a lot of flat, fertile land and an enormous labor force to be profitable. It tends to use up the land very quickly. Tobacco really sort of strips the nutrients out of the soil. So the more tobacco that was planted, the more planters had to keep moving their tobacco cultivation further and further west. In our case, further up the James River, from Smithfield early on in the early 1600s to out towards Richmond, 100 years later. We just keep moving further and further west because the tobacco keeps stripping the nutrients out of the land, and they have to let the land lie fallow or unplanted for a while so that land will become fertile again. It'll rejuvenate itself with a little help. Additionally, tobacco, in order to be profitable as a cultivated agricultural product, required an enormous labor force. You had to have a lot of land, a lot of tobacco planted, and you had to have a lot of people to harvest that tobacco and process it here, dry it out, pack it up, and get it ready to ship over to England. And that, we know from our earlier lecture, would be that labor force by 1670, 80, or 90 would be pretty much all African slaves, or by now African American slaves, that is the descendants of African slaves who were born here in the English colonies. So that's our little discussion on mercantilism there. If you have any questions, ask me when you get to class. Okay, for this next little topic I want to talk about in this unit, I want to talk about the Southern economy. And I want to talk about the Southern economy because it's one that students typically kind of mess up on the tests. Let me say this at the beginning and write this down. The Southern economy is divided into two regions. Okay? You have the Eastern Coastal Lowlands, and you're going to have the Appalachian Foothills. Okay, two regions, Eastern Coastal Lowlands, Appalachian Foothills. We live in the Eastern Coastal Lowlands. When you get out past Richmond today, now you're getting into the Appalachian Foothills where the land starts to roll. So there are two separate economies that we need to talk about. So here we go. The Southern colonies developed economies in the Eastern Coastal Lowlands based on large plantations that grew cash crops, things like tobacco and rice and indigo, all for export to Europe. Remember mercantilism. But if you go further inland, out past Richmond, out to where the land starts to roll, towards the mountains and the valleys of the Appalachian foothill area, the economy is going to change. It's not going to be based on cash crops. It's going to be based on small-scale subsistence farming, hunting, and trading. Now, small-scale subsistence farming is something I need to talk just briefly about. Small-scale farming would be where you have someone who is farming and growing enough to feed their family and then take some surplus to the farmer's market on the weekend. You guys, many of you have probably been to the Smithfield Farmers Market that we have here in the spring and summer, and you can go there and you find people selling tomatoes and corn. You find people selling honey, people making crafts and selling things. Well, that's kind of what they did actually to be. In the colonial period, that actually happened just down the street from where we have the Smithfield Market today. If you go back towards the Bank of America, back that way where it is today, as I understand it, that actually is where the Smithfield Farmers Market was back in the 17th century. So anyway, I'm off topic. Growing enough to have enough to feed your family and then have some left over, some surplus to sell at the market on Saturday, that's small-scale farming. Subsistence farming is a little different. Subsistence farming is where you're just harvesting enough to feed your family. There is nothing left over to take to market. You're just barely scraping by. Okay, it's hard times. So when I say small-scale subsistence farming, what I'm saying is there's a little bit of both going on. So let me go back to my topic here. The southern colonies is the only colonial region that we have to subdivide to better understand its economy. Remember, in the southern coastal lowlands, which is where we live today, the economy was based on cash crops: tobacco, indigo, rice. When you get further west, out past Richmond, out into the Appalachian foothills, the economy was based on small-scale subsistence farming, hunting, and trading. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about in this section is the development of indentured servitude and slavery. The growth of an agricultural and mercantile economy in the hot, humid coastal lowlands of the middle and southern colonies, which we talked, it's in our notes, that focused on cultivating and exporting cash crops, required a cheap labor source on an enormous scale. In other words, the cultivation of tobacco, rice, and indigo from Maryland all the way down to Georgia required more field workers than there were indentured servants. This produced a labor shortage that would be met, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the English, and others, bringing enslaved Africans to the English colonies. Early on, most of the labor needs, especially in Virginia, we already know this, were met by indentured servants, who were usually poor persons from England or Scotland or Ireland, who agreed to work on plantations for a period of time in return for their passage or trip from Europe to the New World. Or maybe they agreed as a way to pay off their debts. One thing I want to point out here is that on the test, make sure you know that indentured servants primarily came from England, Scotland, and Ireland. For our purposes, for our course, that's all you need. They didn't come from anywhere else. Okay? The first African slaves arrived in the English colonies at Jamestown in 1619. But by about 1690, most plantation labor needs were satisfied by the importation of Africans. So let me say that again. The first Africans are going to arrive in 1619, but it's not going to be until, I don't know, right about 1690, maybe a little before that, maybe a little after, that we see in Virginia and in the southern colonies most of the labor sources, or most of the labor supplied, is going to be from them. In other words, by the late 1600s, African slaves have taken the place of indentured servants as the labor force. Although some Africans worked as indentured servants, earned their freedom, and lived as free citizens during the colonial era, over time, a large number of enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to the American colonies via the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is a term you need to take note of. The Middle Passage was a notoriously dangerous transatlantic, meaning across the Atlantic, journey aboard a large sailing ship called a slaver. These slavers were known to overpack their holds with human cargo. The conditions below deck were not fit for anyone. Fresh air was not to be had. Sanitary living conditions did not exist, and access to fresh water and food were not available either. Many Africans perished on this horrible journey, and their bodies were tossed in the sea. Those who survived could not imagine the inhumane treatment they would receive once they arrived in the New World. Once the ships arrived in the colonies, their human cargo was offloaded and prepared for auction. The auctions would be held usually down near the wharves where the ships came in, and the people would be sold off and journey to their new realities on plantations throughout the region here, mainly to work the tobacco fields. Okay, that's all I wanted to say for this section. If you have any questions, please ask me in class.